we are back for our last segment of today, where we still have one very epic talk, and after that, something even more special, which is the panel with the three members of core Angular team. So do make sure that you still stay with us till the end and that you have your questions prepared for them, and also, of course, for our next speaker. So our upcoming talk has the title which says, "Who needs inheritance and composition when you can copy paste the same code in every class?" by Kate Sky. So Kate is a full stack developer with over 20 years of experience who specializes in the front-end development using the Angular platform. She is also a founder of the CSA Technologies Incorporated, which allows her to empower companies with her consulting work. She is also a mother of 5 remarkable children, and one of her main goals is to empower women who code to have fulfilling careers while raising a family. In 2021, she started running a free weekly workshop where she teaches how to get started with Angular. So please, everyone, let's welcome Kate Sky. Hey, welcome.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Thank you. Great. What about you?
I'm doing really well. I'm here in the beautiful autumn Chicago suburb in the United States, and I'm glad to be here.
Sounds amazing. We are very happy to have you here. So, your bio sounds really, really impressive. Like to find the time for all these things. But I guess you're gonna tell us more about it. But I just have to say, like, yeah, the free workshops, like the career, like the big family, helping others, really, really amazing. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's my goal to do all these things, but I do a little bit at a time. But it sounds like a lot.
Well,
but
it definitely is amazing. So, why did you choose this topic? I have to say, it's like a very curious and interesting title of your talk.
Oh, thank you so much. So there was a tweet about how to use inheritance to extend components, and a bunch of people were chiming in, and we ended up with the conclusion that we should be using composition, not inheritance. And the whole idea of why you would be using composition over inheritance and how to implement it in Angular just really got me thinking, like, this is a great topic for beginners, because when I started with Angular, I really didn't know why and when I would use directives. And it's there. Components are very similar to directives. We know the difference between those two. That one has a template and styles, the other one doesn't. But why it's there was like really unclear to me. So I kind of dig up that topic and trying to explain it at the best of my ability with some really clear examples. And hopefully I did my job well and everybody enjoys my topic.
Well, I definitely think that it will be the case. So let's then just jump straight into the talk and see what you have to say.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Sky, and I'm a full stack developer specializing in Angular. I have been working with Microsoft Stack for over 20 years, so when Angular 2 came out and I experimented with TypeScript, I fell in love with the technology and never looked back. I am also a mother to 5 children, and I'm trying to teach them all how to code. So now that you know why I'm talking about composition and inheritance, I want to unbox this topic. I will provide the why and how of harnessing the power of extension at runtime using directives. I will provide best practices of using composition over inheritance and how to make rich Angular components by understanding directives and by creating some directives. Duplicating code is a real problem in software development, especially when you're facing a deadline. We try to reuse components and code in general by following the DRY principle, a principle of software development aimed at reducing the repetition of software patterns and replacing them with an abstraction. The opposite of following this principle would be taking our code and copying and pasting it in a new area we're enhancing. That is the repetition part. So to reduce it would be to not replicate our code. We would use abstraction techniques, and in our case, it would be by creating a directive. When a customer is asking to enhance the product, they don't know about the duplicate code nightmare. They just want the features delivered fast. So if we have to copy code around, we know that we are probably rushed. It is an indication of another more significant problem. For some reason, we didn't have time to design it properly, and sooner or later, we will have to pay this technical debt. So new features or refactoring existing code, let's set some rules. We want to create maintainable, clean code that is easy to change, easy to read, and well organized, with great design that minimizes the duplication of code. So the goal of this talk is to help understand a programming concept of favoring composition over inheritance. We will look at the specific examples of this concept and how it is used in Angular ecosystem. After that, we will dive into specifics of extending components with directives. So why do we have programming concepts? Programming concepts are like punctuation. We have them, but not everyone uses them. The written story is still portrayed, although it may have some terrible consequences if done wrong. Design patterns help us describe the approaches to implementing those principles. It is a reusable solution to a common problem. So when we sit down to design our application, we have the guidance of design patterns to help us. We still have to come up with the code. Before we choose the right design pattern for a duplicated code problem, we will look at the programming principle that we're going to follow. So to understand why we will favor composition over inheritance, let's define both for clarity. Inheritance is a programming concept of one class deriving methods and properties of another class or classes. In TypeScript, we have interfaces that help us address the consistency and validation of types, sort of like a contract that a child class that extends it promises to implement. Inheritance is often called the is-a relationship of parent-child classes. When nothing changes in terms of behavior of the class, you can use inheritance. It is a way of achieving polymorphism of the objects. If things tend to change, like with user interaction or other state changes, you will have to make those modifications in parent and all child classes and possibly introduce bugs to your code. Composition, on the other hand, is easy to understand. It is often called the has-a relationship. There is composition in all aspects of our lives. A house has a roof, walls, windows, and doors. A table has legs, and so on. While inheritance is more of an abstraction we can't touch, the purpose of composition is obvious. You make something whole out of parts. Angular has many examples of what is the best approach, and we find examples everywhere. If we look at Angular material components, although they're components, you will have a hard time finding code that actually is one. They're pretty much all directives. ng module components inputs are TypeScript decorator functions that augment the class or perform operations over its members. When we go to Angular documentation and look at the directives page, we see the description of the directives. And if we compare it to decorator pattern, we see that description of the directives has one-to-one correlation to a decorator pattern. So let's take a look at some examples of composing our components with directives. All right, so we are going to do a live coding session here, and we're going to be composing our component with directives by encapsulating some of the behavior out. And so Angular gives us out-of-the-box directives for manipulating DOM. So let's say we have a dynamic text on the page. So right now I want to refactor kind of backwards into before I show the directive. Okay, so I know that I need to show a badge that will show a renewal date for a customer to submit a survey, and it only shows up when when a call to an API comes back with a value of true. And I already have a user service that reads a text file just to create a promise, and I return it back to whoever calls it. It's an async await kind of call. So if we were to put all this logic in the component, let's say we create a class, we create a p tag. I know that I need an ngIf to control whether it's going to show up or not. And let's just call it flag. So now I know I need to at least have this variable. And now in here, I'm going to have my actual value, right? So some kind of date. So 2 flags so far and a call to an API. So let's go ahead and add those. So we're gonna have a date. That is a string or not. I have a strict mode enabled. So we're gonna do this. Also the flag equals false. And now I need to set them from my call to an API. So I know I need to, so now I need to add my user service to a constructor. All right, so we're gonna define that. Oops. Okay. Okay. And so now we have the user service, and probably the best way to read those values would be from ng on init. So let's implement on init, and we'll create a function. And so here we're going to set our flag to this user service dot the flag. Okay, close parentheses. Oh wait, I don't need the parentheses yet. Not curly brackets at least. All right, so this is going to be on a wait, and it's going to tell us to make the method async. All right, so our flag is set. So now based on this flag, we're going to set our value. Okay, so there's already a lot of logic happening here. So this is where we're going to see that refactoring this out is going to be really clean. So let's do date equals user service dot renew date. Let's see, is that going to work? Is our date string or no? Maybe it just needs to be a string. Well, it also probably needs to go to the top of the page. And let's see. Oh, needs renew. We don't need this. I'm using the wrong one. Okay, renew date. Okay, so this, yeah, it has to be or no. Okay, so we also want to have some string that says renew by, and we're going to wrap this into this. Okay, so now we have our string. So let's go ahead and run this, or find our page that shows up. Okay, let's put this here. Let's open our localhost. Okay, so which one is it? Okay, let's just stop it and restart it. Why not? Let's just make sure this works. So now we implemented our beautiful p tag logic into our component. Okay, let's go ahead and open up. Okay, so here's our page. Okay, so now we have our renew by component piece here, but now we need more things within our component. We also need some logic for filters and some settings and all that. So now we know our component is doing a little bit too much. So what we want to do is we want to create we want to encapsulate this logic into a directive. So let's go ahead and open up our let's open up a different branch, because this is nice, but we want to actually just go through the code and walk through the code that is already there. So let me just commit factor example 1. You guys can have it for later if you wanted to. All right. And we'll go to the branch called example 1. Oh, and check it out. So now we have the same p tag, except no logic about changing the, showing it or not showing it. Let's go ahead and look at our page. Ooh, cool. So we have some new styles and we'll go through them. And also I've added some animation here on the mouse, enter and leave. Just changes the color of this paragraph, which is kind of nice. And what that will help us understand is how to change styles on a directive. So if we look at a renew directive, which I created with ngGenerate, you'll see that I have used the same service. And actually, let me show you the app component really quick. Our app component looks the same way as it did before we refactored backwards. It doesn't have a constructor, it doesn't implement on nginit. It just has other things, other logic that it needs to have for other business logic that we have later on in other directives. So that's kind of good. We don't have a lot of code here. So what we do have here is we have ng-on-init in our directive. And now that we implement ng-on-init and we use the asynchronous function here, we need to use the async keyword here. And what we do is we use the render to add elements to our DOM. And we also use a add class function that render allows us to add a class to our element, and element is also injected in the constructor as well as the render and as well as the user service. So the set property function sets the text content and we construct our whole value over here. Same thing, just nicer. And so now you know that add class actually styles that element that we are referring in the template here. So this is a p tag, doesn't have a class. The class is located in the parent component. I actually have the renew class here that has like the font and everything. So in the renew directive, we can just apply that class like so on line 22. And I also wanted to show you that another way to set styles is by using the host binding. And here with host binding, it attaches to the parent element and changes the background with the style.background annotation, and the host listener just kind of toggles the colors with the events. It's the same thing you would use in a component, but you're using it in directive. So now one thing that usually stumbles people when they do the directive is testing the directive, and especially when we have something like an injected service. So let me just show you really quick this particular directive spec file, and we can actually go ahead and stop our serve and let's do ng test. I think what I did here is I only marked one test for testing. Yeah. All right. So in order to test our asynchronous call to the service, we need to do a little bit of an extra step, and that's using the wait for async. So it's basically a function that wraps our test function, and you would have to have one stable function call on the fixture. And the way you test a directive, you have to have a test component. So you set it up here, and in my case, I created a view child for my component so I can have a reference to the span and kind of read the text content of it. And you will be able to look at this code from my GitHub repo. But let me just show you really quick. My Karma ran in another window, and this is the test that is actually not commented out, but the one that we're expecting our date to have a valid date. No, I don't want to click on that. And if we look in here, what I'm doing is I'm just running the expect command, and I check my text content of the native element to the result that I set up here. Let's see, the result is just a hard-coded string, and it is returned by a mock, which I set in providers to provide my user service with this mock service. And if you look, it's actually not a reference to the mock service, it's an actual class. So I can actually delete that. We don't need that. And in here, I am mocking my two functions. Actually, this is a property renew date. I'm mocking that to return a hard-coded value from up here. And I am just doing a promise that resolve to a true, because I don't have a call to API. I just want to mock that. And that passes, which is good. So we are actually testing that the correct text content was created. And we can do another test here that if we have a need renew flag set to false, that it actually doesn't create anything. So let's go ahead and stop this. Make sure we didn't break anything. I'll just run the ng test one more time, because we did get a pass. Yeah, we did get a success before. All right, we got a success again. One pending spec, 2 specs. So this is green, so we're good. I think we're good. No failures. Okay, good. So let's go ahead and stop with this presentation, and we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so we are going to go through the second example of creating a directive. And in this case, we need something added to our app component that is only displayed for certain settings that the user might have. So imagine that we have many times inside our component a check to see if a user has some settings, whether it's like, has reports or has advanced reports or something like this. But it could be other different settings. So instead of putting them all into this component, we are going to create a directive, and I'm going to go through a directive that does that. And so another thing is the data comes from a data stream, right? Like we get it from the database. So the same thing, we use the user service to get our settings, and we check them based on what that specific piece on the template, whether it's shown or not. And this is going to be another structured directive, and it is marked with an asterisk when you need to pass some variables, and if you don't, it gives you like a squiggly lines. So let's go ahead and switch to, let's see, I have, let's switch to example 2 branch, 2, not 3. And let's just go over just this one directive. So in this example, let's go ahead and serve this. I'll just show you really quick what it does. But like I said, like we have this directive used in multiple places. Like for example, here we have it checking for this particular setting. In this example, we have for 2 different settings, and based on the API call, it's going to either show us this piece of HTML or not. And we achieve this dynamic behavior by using template ref and view container ref. So let's go ahead and just see it in action. We don't have our badge anymore, but we have this new box here that user has access to these couple of reports. So let's just look at our HTML. Looks like this is showing up, but this is not showing up. That means for some reason our user doesn't have advanced reports. But because I know the logic, I can kind of hack it. So let's do has admin. Okay, check it out. Now he has admin reports. See, like this is magic of just changing the values. But let's just go over the code of the directive. We called it app settings directive. And again, I created with ngGenerate out of the box. It gives me the selector. And like I said, we are using the template ref. So we are going to be adding our logic to the DOM based on the user service. If the user has the passed in settings or not. And we have an input called app settings, which matches to the name of the directive. And that's, you actually don't have to specify it when you call the directive with a variable name because it defaults to the first one that has the same name. So the template ref helps us remove the host, add or remove the host element template according to the settings. And the view container ref is referencing to the actual container where that template ref would be added, right? And we use the ng-on-init lifecycle hook in this case because we want this to be checked on the creation of the component. So there's no delay in that. And let's see. So what else we have here? So the view container ref, we use the function called create embedded view, and we just pass in the reference to the template ref. There is no classes, there are no text content because everything is within the reference of the template ref, and whatever is inside the brackets of the calling element with the directive on it is going to be inserted. So this whole piece is going to be inserted, or this whole piece will be inserted. Okay, actually without this div. All right, so this is this example, and let me just show you really quick. The user service has some magic function called has, and it just checks to see if the app settings are odd or even number in length. But in real life, you would probably go to the server and get that value from your API. You can also cache it here in this inside the service. I like to use a promise, and the reason I use the promise because when you are getting a value for a directive, there's really nothing to observe. It's something that you just get and you show it, but there might be other opinions about it. I like it in the same way we saw the example inside our renew directive. We would use the same thing here, but right now this is a regular variable. There is no asynchronous call here. And also when this is false, the view container ref is cleared, and this is how to remove it. So this is how to add that template, and this is how to remove it. Okay, so that is our second example, and let's go into our third and final. So now we will have our third and last example of creating a directive. And in this directive, we are actually going to be checking user permissions based on their selection. So let's say for some reason we have some checkboxes and we would like the user to click on them, and then based on that user interaction we would go to the database or API and check to see if they could see some extra things. Okay, so that's going to be some state changes, so it's not static as we had it in previous examples. So let's go ahead and check out that code in our example 3. And again, our master branch has all 3 examples combined. I just wanted to show you each example on a separate branch, so you have that. So for this directive, before we go into directive, let's go ahead and run this really quick. And just to show you what user sees on the page when they click onto the checkboxes. Okay, so here's our page again. And the user now wants to see some social security and date of birth. So when they click on it, something appears on the page. And this is doesn't actually show you my social security and date of birth, but let's imagine that it went out into the API and it got the permissions, and it's like, okay, this user can see it. All right, so let's go ahead and close our windows and go over the code really quick. All right, so this is going to be the same directive that we've seen before. It's going to use template ref and view container ref. The only caveat here is for the inputs, we are going to use getters and setters to toggle our embedded view. So we are going to use the set on the input parameter app filters, and whenever it changes, it will hit this method. And unlike on ng changes lifecycle hook, this is a little bit different way I'm doing it. But the same thing, it goes to the service, it checks to see if the user has those filters as their permissions, and it does clear the template first and then creates it just in case something was there that shouldn't be before. And the get just returns that value. And again, this is just another way of using the interactive dynamic way of creating an embedded view of calling component. Okay, so that kind of concludes the demonstration of the 3 types of directives. And I'm going to have all 3 of those branches for you to check out later. So in those examples, I demonstrated that when you plan your components, you will pay close attention to the number of things that your component does. Do you have many flags that you end up setting from API calls that control the dynamic behavior of the component? Do changes in application state involve a DOM manipulation? Encapsulate that logic into directives, and your components will be lightweight, and you will be able to test specific functionality of your application easily. So when you're doing your regular refactoring, remember that directives is another way of refactoring things out of your component. Ideally, we want to make our components as light as possible, because when it comes to testing, components are one of the harder things to test. You have visual and functional nature of the components, and most of us are familiar with the concept of refactoring the business logic out of components into services, but not so much of taking dynamic behavior of the components and refactoring them out into directives. By taking that behavior out, you're doing 2 things: making your component not as complex, and you're giving yourself this other piece, this directive, that you can compose into other components as well. Happy refactoring, everyone! Have a great day!
Okay, welcome. So thank you for the great talk. Please, folks, do not hesitate to ask the question in the Q&A panel for the Kate or in the chat so we can relay them to the Kate. And yeah, like first thing which comes to mind is like, because I have to say, like for me, this approach is pretty new. Like I usually used to do stuff like with the components. So like what can be like some good guideline to know like when it's a time that maybe the directive could be the right solution, like when refactoring my logic?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of different things you could consider. The first one that comes to mind is like your component is getting kind of big and out of control, and you're doing so many different things on your component, which is usually the case on your main component anyways. But you want to make it just a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to maintain. And you're looking for pieces of code that changes with the flag. And that flag comes from like an API. That's like one of the first things that I would look into refactoring out. And so this way, in your main component, you don't have that extra selector or extra call to the API to set the flag. So you're removing the call to the API, you're removing the flag. All of that goes into your dynamic directive, your directive. So that's kind of like the top two things that I would look for. I'm sure there are more, but those are kind of like they're business logic related, and that we're used to doing the business logic refactoring. So just another way of looking at refactoring business logic.
Makes sense. And then what could be like the guideline on when to decide like for the directive versus like more components, right? Because like the Angular is famous like that. What we learned often is that like we should extract additional components, but of course this approach has like this probably benefit that these directives don't really have their own template, or how would be the best way to look into that?
Well, with the components, you're going to have a template, right? And if you're seeing that your template is nothing but some styled, tag like a div or something, and it's very, very small, if you can think about kind of taking that and putting into a directive in terms of like, hey, do I really need a separate style sheet for this class? Do I really need like this new another file? Although you can put a template in line now, right? And you can even put the styles in line into your TypeScript file. Do you really need them there? Like, are they really like a separate entity? Because directives are just going to be like a little bit of a smaller footprint, anyways, because it's just one file versus three, and the class could be already bundled with your main style sheet.
Makes sense. Now we have a question in the Q&A from Massimo. He asks, when do you start thinking about moving some logic into a directive if a behavior is shared among multiple components or even if it's a single large component? So this extends on what we just discussed, so
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. So actually, this is a great point, because that's actually why you would want to create a separate directive, is because you are able to plug it in just like any component into other components where you would be using that functionality. So it's self-contained, and you can just extract it into a directive and reuse it as much as you have to.
Sounds good. So hope, Massimo, you're happy with the answer. I would be also curious about like how to say, like when you are like, often we are using like some kind of like a state management library in the larger Angular applications. How would this work together with this approach? For example, if we had an application which uses ngrx or like ngxs or anything like that.
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, because I have just created a directive using NGRX library, getting some dynamic data from the store, because my store has this piece of data, and you do it the same way. You inject, like I like facades for NGRX, although you don't need it. You could just inject, instead of the facade service, you could inject your store, and your call to the API is just a selector. So the same thing, and it's even better because the data is already loaded once. It's if your properties don't change on that on the selector, then everything is the same. You have cached information inside your store, and it goes inside the directive just the same way. Instead of the service that we've injected, you just inject either your facade service or your store.
Makes perfect sense. So basically, exactly the same way as we did with the service, we can do with any kind of injectable thing in Angular that means store. So it's not actually any issue, and this approach can be used. I would also like to ask, like now, like basically already said, like you have been writing this kind of directive, if you could provide us with some of the real life examples of the use cases which you solved with this approach, like on a real customer projects, right?
Yeah. So the one that I've just created, it's a simple example of adding a date that each user has depending on their selection. They have a specific date that describes their data. Like, for example, we have these surveys that users submit, and whatever data that they're seeing is based on the effective date of their submitted data. And that date is dynamic. It comes from the database. We load it to a server, to our state management. So it's inside the store, and there is a small class. There is a small piece of data that's kind of constructs that date. Same way we did with the renew, only just a little bit of a different type of date. But that's kind of the last one I did. And I have a unit test for it the same exact way I did it. So this is going to go to production.
Makes sense. So that's always good to hear, like that those examples which we are seeing are actually based on like the real life experience, because this is usually the most valuable. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Sure.
We have another question in the Q&A from Radovan. Has inheritance impact on the final bundle size if we have one base class for service that holds the shared logic in few methods? Store some logic in few methods, store some properties, and there are 10 descendants of such a service. Is composition better in that case? I would be also very interested, actually, like what is the impact when we are doing, like, I have actually no idea how this is bundled in the end, but probably it will be just like with the JavaScript, like through the prototype. So it should maybe not have, I don't know.
Well, as far as I know, that anytime you're using interfaces over classes, your bundle size is smaller. That's what I've heard. But you're using inheritance, you're implementing some interfaces with classes, right? So the classes are going to create a little bit of a bigger impact. But in terms of business logic inside of like, I really don't know. I'm not really sure how you would use one over the other. Like, one is inheritance, one is a composition. I would have to look at the code and see what you're doing differently in both cases. So it's hard to say.
That's true, because like even if we have like 10 descendants through the inheritance, or we are composing stuff into 10 different other services, like we are still having 10 things which are doing something else. So in the end, it really depends on like case by case basic, most likely. Cool. So hopefully, Radovan, you're happy with your answer. And do we have some more questions, folks? Please do not hesitate, ask. And if I have look what I have written, yeah, no, we have that. Yeah, how to say? Yeah, the one thing which comes to mind like was this use of the renderer, right? In one of those examples, does this have any kind of like then impact if we now with like the IV? I'm actually not sure what's the situation with this render API between the view engine and the IV only world of the Angular 13. That would be something which I would like to know.
That's a great question. I'm going to have to look it up and see. Maybe
Right.
next time we can talk about it.
Right, definitely. Anyway, folks, so if there is nothing more, then Kate, let me thank you again for a great talk. I hope we can see you sometimes in the future edition of the Angular Day, and wish you all the best. Until next time. Ciao, ciao, Kate.
Ciao.